A fisherman off the coast of Java pulls up his net and finds a stone tool. Not a rock that looks like a tool. An actual hand axe, shaped by human fingers. He's standing on a wooden boat, 60 meters above the seabed, holding something that someone made in a place where no one was supposed to live. Because the spot where that net dragged the bottom, it isn't ocean floor in any normal sense. It used to be ground. Walkable, breathable, sunlit ground. And the people who shaped that axe walked across it before the water came. That's the part nobody told you in school. Underneath the Java Sea, the Gulf of Thailand, the South China Sea, there's a continent, a real one, the size of half of Europe, with rivers carved into it, valley systems, mountain ridges that are now underwater hills, and coastlines that used to belong to a country that doesn't exist anymore. Scientists call it Sundaland. And for the last 20 years, geologists, geneticists, and a small group of very stubborn researchers have been arguing about one thing: who lived there before the sea swallowed it? Let me show you what we actually know, because this is not a theory anymore. This is hard data, and it gets stranger the deeper you go. Start with the maps. If you take any modern bathymetric chart, the kind that shows ocean depth in detail, and you erase every patch of water shallower than 120 meters, something insane happens to Southeast Asia. Indonesia stops being islands. Borneo, Sumatra, Java, the Malay Peninsula, they fuse into one enormous landmass. The Gulf of Thailand becomes a flat plain you could walk across in a week. From Vietnam, you could stroll on dry land all the way to Bali without ever getting your feet wet. That entire region, about 1.8 million square kilometers, was above sea level for tens of thousands of years. We're not guessing. The drowned river channels are right there on the sonar. The Molengraaf River system, named after a Dutch geologist, ran for over 900 kilometers across what is now seabed. We can see its delta. We can see where it forked. We can see the lakes it fed. So the geography is real. The continent existed. The question is who was on it, and how long, and what happened to them. For a long time, the answer the textbooks gave was not much. Some hunter-gatherers, a few scattered bands, nothing significant. Asia's civilizations rose later, in the river valleys of China and India, and Southeast Asia was just a backwater that caught the overflow. That story started cracking around the year 2000, and the man with the hammer was a researcher named Stephen Oppenheimer, a British medical doctor who'd spent years working in Borneo and Papua New Guinea. He wrote a book called Eden in the East. The argument was simple and infuriating to mainstream archaeology. Sundaland wasn't a backwater, it was a center. The flooding that destroyed it pushed surviving populations outward, in every direction, carrying knowledge, language, agriculture, and the bones of stories the world would later mistake for myth. Most archaeologists rolled their eyes. There was no city under the Java Sea, no pyramids, no carved temples being hauled up in fishing nets. Without monuments, you can't claim civilization. End of argument. Except the genetics didn't agree. In the 2000s and 2010s, large-scale DNA studies started coming out of labs in Singapore, Tokyo, Leipzig, and Houston. They were tracking human migrations through mitochondrial markers, Y chromosome haplogroups, and eventually whole genome sequencing of populations across Asia and the Pacific. And a pattern showed up that nobody had predicted. Populations spread out from Southeast Asia in a way that looked like a starburst, not a trickle. Genetic diversity in the region was higher and deeper than in the surrounding mainland. The people of Madagascar, 4,000 miles away across the Indian Ocean, carry markers that point straight back to Borneo. The Polynesians, who eventually populated every habitable speck of the Pacific from Hawaii to Easter Island, trace their language and their genes back through Taiwan to a homeland in the Sunda region. Even certain populations in southern China carry signatures that suggest movement north, into the mainland, not the other way around. In other words, the genes were saying something happened in Sundaland that pushed a lot of people in a lot of directions. Hard, all at once, and it happened during the exact window when the sea was rising. Let's slow down on that window, because this is where the story gets brutal. Around 20,000 years ago, the planet was deep in the last glacial maximum. Ice sheets 2 kilometers thick sat on top of Canada and Scandinavia. So much water was locked up in those glaciers that global sea levels were about 120 meters lower than today. That's what gave Sundaland its dry floor. People lived there for tens of thousands of years under those conditions, hunting, fishing in the rivers, gathering in the warm tropical climate. The interior of Sundaland would have been one of the most pleasant environments on Earth. No glaciers, no ice age cold snaps, plenty of game, plenty of plants, stable rainfall. Then the ice started melting. It didn't happen smoothly. It happened in pulses. There were 3 big jumps in sea level, called meltwater pulses, between about 14,000 and 7,000 years ago. Pulse 1A is the famous one. In a window of maybe 4 centuries, possibly less, global sea levels rose by something like 20 meters. 20 meters. Try to picture what that means on a flat continental shelf. If the ground slopes very gently, 20 vertical meters can translate into hundreds of horizontal kilometers of land disappearing. In Sundaland, the slope is gentle almost everywhere. Coastlines didn't creep inland. They walked. They marched. People who built a fishing village on the beach saw the beach gone in their grandchildren's lifetime. By the time of Pulse 1B, the same thing happened again, and the final blow came around 7,000 years ago, when the last of the meltwater finished pouring in, and the modern shoreline locked into place. Run the math on the area lost. From the glacial maximum to today, Sundaland surrendered roughly half of its territory. A landmass the size of India, gone underwater. Not gradually over 1 million years, gone in a handful of millennia. Gone fast enough that the people living there would have known it was happening. Gone fast enough that the loss became a memory, and the memory became a story, and the story got carried wherever the survivors carried themselves. Now here's the question I'd like you to sit with for a second. If a continent the size of India drowned in human historical time, while humans were watching, while they were already making tools and burying their dead and telling each other things around the fire, do you really think they wouldn't have a word for it? Look at the flood myths of Southeast Asia. Not the Bible, not Gilgamesh, the local ones. The Iban people of Borneo tell of a great deluge sent by an angry deity that drowned the lowlands. The Batak of Sumatra describe how the world was once one large land, and then the waters came and broke it into pieces. The Aboriginal stories of the Andaman Islanders, a population that's been genetically isolated for so long that they're a living archive of ancient Asia, include a flood that swallowed their ancestral homeland. Push further out. The Australian Aboriginal stories from the North Coast describe coastline changes and lost land in ways that match, with disturbing precision, what marine archaeologists have actually mapped on the seafloor. Researchers in Australia have shown that some of those oral histories preserve sea level events from over 7,000 years ago, making them quite possibly the oldest continuous narratives on Earth. Stories that outlived the rise of every empire we have records of. Stories older than the wheel. Which brings us back to the people. Who were they actually? What did they look like? What did they know? What did they leave behind? Here's where the absence of stone temples gets tricky. Because the assumption baked into most archaeology, that without stone monuments, there's no real civilization, is a Eurasian assumption. It's the kind of thing you believe if you grew up looking at Stonehenge and Giza. But what if the people of Sundaland were a maritime tropical culture, the way the Polynesians later were? What if their cities were wood, bamboo, rattan, palm, materials that rot in 2 seasons under the equator's rains? What if their boats were lashed reed and outrigger? Their tools mostly organic, their wealth in fish weirs and gardens rather than carved obelisks? You would expect to find almost nothing of them, even on land. Underwater, after 8,000 years of waves and silt and reef growth, you would find effectively zero. And yet you do find things. Submerged stone tool sites have been recovered from the Java Sea. The Naya caves of Borneo have produced human remains dating back 40,000 years. Hoabinhian stone tool traditions, which appear all over mainland and island Southeast Asia, suggest a continuous, sophisticated, mobile population that knew how to work with what the environment gave them. Pottery in this region is older than pottery in most of the rest of the world. The earliest sea voyages we know of, those that put humans on Australia by at least 50,000 years ago, required real boats, real navigation, real planning. Those skills didn't appear out of nowhere. They were honed somewhere. most likely on the coastlines that don't exist anymore. There's a study I want you to remember. Researchers analyzing rice cultivation genetics traced the origins of certain domesticated rice strains back to Southeast Asia, not the Yangtze River Valley, as the older theory held. Bananas, taros, sugarcane, many of the crops that fed half the ancient world have their origins in this same region. If you were a horticulturalist in Sundaland 10,000 years ago, you were living in one of the richest plant zones on the planet. You could have been farming, quietly, without leaving the kind of evidence that survives in stone-friendly climates. Okay, so if you're with me so far, you're holding two big ideas at once. One, a continent existed, was inhabited, and got drowned during a window when modern humans were already capable of complex culture. Two, the survivors went somewhere, and they carried something with them. Let me tell you where they went, because this is where the story stops being archaeology and starts being a map of half the planet. North. Some moved up into mainland Southeast Asia and southern China. Their genes show up in modern Vietnamese, Thai, and southern Chinese populations. They likely brought maritime skills and tropical agriculture with them, mixing with the existing inland populations. East. The Lapita people, ancestors of the Polynesians, eventually launched outrigger canoes into the Pacific and colonized every island they could find, a feat of navigation that wasn't matched by Europeans until almost yesterday in historical terms. Their roots, traced back through linguistics and DNA, go to the Sunda region. West. The Austronesian expansion didn't just go east. A branch of it went all the way across the Indian Ocean and settled Madagascar around 1,500 years ago. Today, the language of Madagascar, Malagasy, is more closely related to languages spoken in Borneo than to anything on the African mainland a few miles offshore. The Malagasy people grow rice, raise zebu cattle, and sail outrigger canoes. They are, in a real biological and cultural sense, transplanted Sundalanders. South, across to Australia, where some of the oldest continuous human cultures on the planet still live, carrying flood stories that match the maps of what their ancestors lost. And right where Sundaland used to be, of course there are still people. Today's Indonesians, Malaysians, Filipinos, Bruneians. They are not later arrivals to an empty landscape. They are the descendants of those who stayed, who climbed the rising ridges as the water came, who reorganized their lives on what used to be hilltops and now are islands. If you trace it on a map, you get this strange thing: a single ancient region, a single set of cultural and genetic roots, scattered now across half the globe. From Madagascar to Easter Island, from Taiwan to Tasmania, connected by genes, by language families, by sailing technology, and by the memory, sometimes faint but rarely absent, of a place that used to be there and isn't anymore. So why hasn't this been front-page news? Why aren't there documentaries about Sundaland the way there are about Atlantis? A few reasons, all of them honest. The first is that real science is conservative, slow, and tends to wait for shovels to confirm what genes and geology suggest. Underwater archaeology in tropical seas is brutal. Bad visibility, strong currents, monsoon seasons, fishing trawlers tearing up sites, and the simple physical reality that anything organic has long since rotted. Doing an excavation 100 kilometers offshore at 60 meters depth costs more than most archaeology departments will see in a decade. The second reason is that Sundaland got attached, early on, to the wrong kind of attention. Atlantis hunters seized on it. Mystery channels turned it into clickbait. Serious researchers backed away because nobody wants to share a citation list with people who think the pyramids were built by aliens. Oppenheimer himself was treated cautiously by the field, even though most of his geological claims have held up. The mainstream conclusion was, yes, there was a drowned continent. Yes, people lived there. No, we have no proof of a great civilization. Let's not overclaim. That's a reasonable scientific position. But it also means the story sits in this awkward middle space. Too well established to dismiss, not flashy enough to compete with Egypt. Too watery to dig. And maybe that's the most honest place to leave you. Sundaland is real. The continent is there. The people were there. The flood happened. The survivors spread out and built almost everything you now associate with the Pacific and Southeast Asia. But the centerpiece, the question of what their everyday lives looked like, Whether they had towns, what their language sounded like, whether the flood myths of 36 cultures all trace back to a single shared catastrophe. That part is still buried under 120 meters of warm, dark water. I want you to think about what that means. Right now, while you're listening to this, there are riverbeds down there, stones that were once arranged by hands, maybe fire pits, maybe the post holes of houses, dissolved into the sediment, but still leaving a trace if anyone went looking with the right equipment. Generations of human life, 8,000 years gone, lying under the Java Sea like an unread book. Most of human history is underwater. Take that thought and hold it. The shorelines where our ancestors actually lived, fished, mated, raised children, and buried their dead during the entire arc of the Stone Age. Almost all of those shorelines are now ocean floor. The dry land sites we excavate represent the inland minority of human activity, not the majority. We have been studying the highlanders of our species and calling it the whole story. Sundaland is the biggest, clearest example of what we've missed, but not the only one. There's Doggerland under the North Sea, the Bering Land Bridge under the strait of the same name, submerged coastlines off every continent. Each one has its own version of this question. Who lived there? What did they know? Where did they go? Drop a comment with the part of this that hit you hardest. The flood story angle. The genetic spread to Madagascar. The idea that real cities might be down there in wood and bamboo. Beyond recovery. I read them. I want to know which thread you want pulled next, because the seabed has more of these stories than we can cover in one video. And the next one I make on the topic depends on what you tell me you want to see. Here's the last thing. The fisherman from the start. The one who pulled the hand axe out of the net. We don't know his name, and we don't know which fisherman or which week or which boat, because the same thing happens regularly off the coasts of Java and Sumatra and southern Vietnam. Stone tools come up in the nets. Pieces of bone, worked shells. Most of them get thrown back. Some get sold to tourists. A few make it into museum drawers, where they sit unlabeled, because nobody knows quite what to do with an object that proves people were living in a place where there is now 60 meters of ocean. If you want to know who lived on the drowned continent under Southeast Asia, the honest answer is your relatives. Probably mine too. We just haven't figured out their address yet, and the address is at the bottom of the Java Sea, somewhere along a riverbed that hasn't seen the sun since the last ice age ended. The water is patient. It's been holding on to them for 8,000 years. We're only just now starting to ask the right questions.